Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second part of our lesson on kind of the highs and lows of the globalization of labor in the world, essentially the issue of the global assembly line. We talked about some of the advantages yesterday, right? The standardized product that we can sell more for less because of similar global tastes, some of the cost flexibility that you get from the global division of labor. You're not dependent on a single source of supply for a specific component, so you're not so vulnerable to industrial troubles and other disturbances. Got better access to local markets, right? But what are some of the negative aspects? Well, to start out, I had a video that I wanted you to watch today to kind of get started on things. It was a video from ABC News, kind of asking the question of what is actually made in the United States, right? Consumption is still concentrated in the developed world. But when you look at what's actually made in the USA, you will notice, based on the video that you will watch, that the answer is very little, right? And you'll get more detail of that from the video that you watch. It's part of your lesson for today. It's just 2 or 3 minutes, but pretty insightful. You see, following cheap labor, the American clothing industry moved from its original home in the Northeast. Actually, the American textile industry is actually rooted in the Boston area, believe it or not. But long time ago, in the early 20th century, the American clothing industry moved from its home in the Northeast to the American South, where labor was cheaper, where labor was not unionized. Eventually moved to Japan in the 1950s. To Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Korea in the 1970s, 1980s, to China, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Thailand in the late 80s. Saw a big movement to Mexico and to India and Turkey in the 1990s. And in the 2000s, a lot of our textile manufacturing takes place in Bangladesh and Cambodia and Mauritius and Morocco, Vietnam, El Salvador, Honduras, just to name a few countries. You see, just like anything else that we've been talking about, the clothes are designed by retailers, right? And then they're marketed by stores, right? Walmart, Macy's, Gap, right? Sometimes high-end fashion lines as well. And then they contract out the production to essentially low-wage countries. To kind of give you an idea of how low wage we're actually talking here, look at the graphic here where it kind of compares the cost per hour in LDCs compared to MDCs. The U.S. is kind of actually on the lower end of MDC on this one when it comes to hourly wages. Denmark and Germany on the much higher end. But when you think about it, just even, considering the United States, the hourly compensation for apparel workers in the U.S. is about $12 an hour for a 37-hour work week plus benefits. In Hong Kong, the same work can be done for $5 an hour in a 50 to 60-hour work week. Mainland China, 20 cents an hour for a 72-hour work week. So the profits made in the United States is about 70%. If you're manufacturing textiles in Southeast Asia, where labor is even cheaper than I just mentioned sometimes, American companies can make up to 250% profit on textiles. And these types of garment factories make up about half of Sri Lanka's economy and income, about 63% of Bangladesh's, about 76% of Cambodia's. Unfortunately, sometimes the consequences are disastrous. When more attention is given to profits than workers' conditions in a lot of these countries. One of the things that you're going to be watching for your lesson today is a clip from BBC News about a factory collapse in the country of Bangladesh, in the city of Dhaka. It's pretty jarring, but it emphasizes what happens sometimes when profits are being put ahead of workers' conditions. Well, a lot of these areas where you're going to see big time, manufacturing taking place in LDCs are known as EPZs, export processing zones. which are basically small areas within which especially favorable investment and trading conditions are created by governments in order to attract export oriented industries and transnational corporations like the ones that we talked about yesterday. The conditions would be little rules on trade, low rent factory space and warehouses, low taxes, exemption from taxes on imports, tariffs. There's actually about 850 EPZs in the world. You're looking at several of them here on the map that I just posted. In China, they're called special economic zones or SEZs, but they're essentially the same thing. Got about 27 million workers employed in these EPZs around the world. About 90% of them are women because cheaper labor. And China has 18 million 18 million people alone working in about 124 of these EPZs, or again, what we call in China special economic zones. The problem is that these zones have little to no meaningful links with the domestic economies around them. In other words, these are economic zones that are designed specifically for export out, mainly to core countries. They don't necessarily benefit the domestic economy within those countries, and most trap large numbers of people in low-wage, low-skill jobs. This, of course, is not the plan, right? As these countries are hoping for this to be a stepping stone to their own manufacturing to benefit themselves later on down the road. They hope to shift from more labor-intensive to more capital-intensive jobs. Sometimes it works out that way. We talked about this in South Korea, I guess it was last week, but it hasn't been the reality for most. Some countries see global assembly lines as a pathway. Hey, buddy. I'm recording a lesson though. Okay. Yeah, but I need you to go back to mom because I'm recording a lesson. Okay. All right. Thank you, buddy. That will probably happen several times more over the next few weeks. Anyway, where were we? Some countries see global assembly lines as a pathway to export-led industrialization, basically the Japan model, right? The Rosto model that we looked at last week. One of those countries is Mexico. Mexico kind of sees its role in the global assembly line as sort of a pathway to industrialization for itself. And in Mexico, these factories are known as maquiladoras, and you see it spelled out there on the top right of the screen. In the 1960s, really, this is what it goes back to. In the 1960s, Mexico enacted legislation, a series of laws that permitted foreign companies to establish maquiladoras within about 12 miles of the border with the United States for tax-free assembly of products to be sent back to the U.S., to be exported free of tariffs. Little environmental regulation, cheaper labor attracted a lot of companies in. Basically, what Mexico does is it imports components from American companies, assembles them in these maquiladoras, and then exports them back to the United States tariff-free. What's in it for Mexico is, well, a couple of things. One, jobs, right? I mean, it does mean job creation. What's in it for the United States is actually it's cheaper. Your products on the shelves in the U.S. are going to be cheaper for the American consumer being put together or assembled in maquiladoras than if they were assembled in the United States. The attraction of these is that these maquiladoras have very easy access to U.S. export markets, just like special economic zones in China have easy access to global ports. And in this case, because they're right across the U.S. border, and there's a big wage and benefit difference between the United States and Mexico. So cheaper labor, cheaper transport, and as a result, you see in maquiladoras the production of electronic equipment, electrical appliances, automobiles. A lot of your cars that are on the road in the United States are assembled in maquiladoras. We looked at a couple of those by Toyota, right, last week. textiles, plastics, furniture, you name it. What heightens this is that in 1994, the NAFTA agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement, eliminated most barriers to moving goods among Mexico, the US, and Canada. And because it's the nearest low wage country to the United States, Mexico attracted labor intensive industries and prompted further industrialization of the border region by building up more maquiladoras in cities like Juarez, cities like Tijuana, and by facilitating the movement of service industries to Mexico too. So in any case, there's been some benefit here for sure. By 2005, there were 3,500 maquiladoras that were established in Mexico, employing 1 million workers, again, mostly women, accounting for about 30% of all Mexican exports. This has been pretty controversial as well, though, because these factories hire young women and men for low pay, few, if any, benefits. They put them to work in repetitive jobs, in environmentally questionable conditions. And some have said that the NAFTA agreement actually created more cross-border disparity between the United States and Mexico than existed before. You can see this when you compare just shots of El Paso, Texas, to its sister city Juarez across the border, or shots of San Diego compared to its sister city Tijuana across the border. Many of these maquiladoras in recent years have also shut down. With tax breaks expiring and cheaper labor being available in other countries like Honduras or El Salvador, or even China, which has led to a lot of job loss in these areas. We said that you could pay an American textile worker $12 to $14 an hour. In Mexico, you're looking at the same job being done for $6 an hour. But those wages are much higher than the $1 an hour wages that could be paid out in India. Or Pakistan. So, sometimes with the flexible model, these jobs end up leaving Mexico anyway, and leaving communities with some high rates of unemployment. Mexico is still much closer to the United States, though, geographically. So in terms of shipping costs, you're saving quite a bit. So a lot of these maquiladoras continue down. But now you possibly start triggering a competitive race to the bottom, right? Because now you've got countries competing against each other for, who can basically provide or promise the lowest wages, the highest tax breaks, and lowest amount of environmental regulation. This isn't necessarily the most positive thing at the end of the day, especially the tax break piece, because essentially, when you have big tax breaks being handed out, it doesn't mean it means not a lot of revenue is coming into cities that house these manufacturing facilities, and so that becomes an issue as well. All right, well, that is the end of our lesson for today. It looks like my son has come back into my setup office for the day. Axel, do you want to say hi? Of course. All right, sit in my lap.
Hello.
All right. This is Daddy's class that he's recording today, okay? All right. So say bye to everybody.
Bye.
Okay. All right, guys, we'll see you tomorrow.